Imagine getting a death penalty in India for a crime that was just a minor fine in England. That's what the British legal system did in the 1770s. Imagine the executive head of a country deploying the actual military to arrest the officials of its own Supreme Court. Sounds like a dystopian political thriller, right? Well, this actually happened in India. The year was 1779. The East India Company's military troops physically stopped the sheriff of the Calcutta Supreme Court from arresting a jamindar. The government literally went to war with its own judiciary. Why? Because nobody knew who was actually in charge. The British Parliament had passed the Regulating Act of 1773 to fix the massive corruption inside the East India Company. The act created two massive power centers in Bengal, the Governor General with his council and a brand new Supreme Court. It was supposed to be a system of checks and balances. Instead, it became a brutal, tough war. Think of a startup where the CEO and the external auditor have the exact same power to fire people, but completely different rule books. Total paralysis. For 8 chaotic years, the Governor General Warren Hastings and the Chief Justice Elijah Impey were at each other's throats. The Supreme Court started issuing arrest warrants against the company's revenue collectors. The Governor General retaliated by ordering the Jamindars to completely ignore the Supreme Court. Here is the twist. The Supreme Court judges were British lawyers, fresh off the boat from London. They started applying strict, unyielding English law to Indian farmers and local officials who did not even know where London was on a map. Imagine a local tax collector in Bengal getting dragged to Calcutta, locked in a filthy jail, and tried under an alien British law for a simple procedural error in Indian revenue collection. The entire tax collection system of Bengal practically collapsed because the jamindars were terrified of the court. They were hiding, they were refusing to collect taxes. And for the British, if the money stops flowing, the empire dies. This is where we get stuck. And honestly, it's frustrating. We read those historical acts like they are just dry legal documents, memorizing bullet points for an exam, but they are not. They are desperate, panic stricken attempts to stop a civil war. It's a mafia tough war disguised as a legal framework. By 1780, the British Parliament panicked. They realized that if they did not draw a hard line between the Governor General and the Supreme Court, the British Empire in India would destroy itself from the inside out. So they introduced the fix, the Amending Act of 1781. Historically, we call it the Act of Settlement, and settlement is exactly what it was. It was Parliament stepping in, pulling the two fighting kids apart and drawing a line in the sand. Let's break down exactly what this act did and why it forms the bedrock of administrative history. First, they built a firewall around the executive. The act clearly stated that the Governor General and his council were entirely exempt from the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court for anything they did in their official capacity. If Warren Hastings made a policy decision, the Chief Justice could no longer issue a warrant against him. The executive was freed from the constant breathing down the neck scrutiny of the judiciary. Second, they protected the money. Because remember, the British were merchants first. The Amendment Act explicitly removed all matters regarding revenue collection from the Supreme Court's control. Zamindars, landholders, and the company's revenue agents could no longer be dragged into the Supreme Court for their official duties. The tax collection machinery was safely locked away from the judges. But wait, this gets worse. You would think the Supreme Court would still have power over the regular people of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa, right? It did not. The Act of 1781 brutally slashed the territorial reach of the court. It was restricted only to the inhabitants of Calcutta. If you live outside the city limits, the Supreme Court basically did not exist for you. Now, here is where it gets interesting. Most people stop here, they memorize the separation of powers and move on. But the real story, the one that actually shaped modern India, starts right now. Because inside Calcutta, the Supreme Court still had to judge Indians. And Parliament finally realized that forcing English common law onto Indian society was a catastrophic mistake. So, the Act of 1781 introduced a monumental shift in how justice was delivered. It ordered the Supreme Court to respect the religious and social customs of the Indians. It explicitly stated that Hindus were to be tried according to Hindu law and Muslims were to be tried according to the Muslim law. Think about the sheer scale of this decision. The British officially recognized and codified a dual legal system for personal laws in India, a legacy that we are still aggressively debating in the 21st century when we talk about a uniform civil code. It started right there in 1781 as a compromise to keep the peace. And finally, what about the people living outside Calcutta? If they could not go to the Supreme Court, where did their appeals go? The Act formalized a hierarchy of provincial courts. If you had a grievance in a village, you went to the provincial court. If you wanted to appeal that decision, you did not go to the Supreme Court in Calcutta. You went to the Sardar Divani Adalat. And who headed the Sardar Divani Adalat? The Governor General and his council. Do you see the genius of what Parliament did? They did not just separate the powers, they made the executive the highest appellate authority for the vast majority of the country. They legalized the supremacy of the Governor General. The Amending Act of 1781 was not just a minor tweak to the previous law. It was the moment the British definitively decided how they were going to rule India. They chose administrative efficiency and revenue over judicial oversight. They chose to accommodate local customs not out of respect but out of political survival. Policies don't fail on paper, they fail in execution. The Regulating Act of 1773 looked perfect in the halls of London, but it created anarchy on the dusty streets of Bengal. The Act of 1781 is a masterclass in pragmatic, ruthless course correction. It teaches us a fundamental truth about governance. Institutions are only as strong as the boundaries that contain them.